Mitchell called.
Do we ever think that Joni Mitchell or something like that calls upon stripping the floor or something like that? As much as you're around celebrity, every once in a while when you realize that there I am with Stan Getz, and I'm thinking, my God, this man has played such music and so forth, and he got all concerned about what kind of bread we should have for the sandwiches he was going to make me for lunch. I went up to see him up in Northern California. He lives up there. And hearing you talk about this, or Linda Ronstadt has had a bad lawn problem. And for some reason, as much as we deal in this, and I've certainly been around it.
You don't think people have ordinary lives?
Or you don't think you do it. Now, I know for sure that Sinatra does not do it.
Yeah.
He carries echelons of people to go do it. So God forbid he should ever get on a plane. And as a matter of fact, as part of this thing,
Too, the man in his army too.
Yeah, I guess so.
You know, I think it has to do with more with self-image than necessity. You know, if you see yourself as a kingly type, you know, then you need your serfs and your army and so on around you. Jackson's like that. I think Jackson Browne needs an entourage.
Yes, Jackson loves to have 3 or 4 people around that if the water is leaking or something like that. And I watched it happen with Steve Ross. You know,
but they're all sycophants eventually, like, you know,
of course they'll leave. Of course they'll leave. What are they going to stay for if you're not hot and you're not riding? But I don't guess they think beyond that. I don't guess Jackson thinks beyond that, or Sinatra thinks beyond that. I don't know. It's interesting, but when here you are making this phone call, there's a lot of workmen running around, the guy wants you to sign something, and you're looking for the guy. I thought you were looking for a ranger working on a piece of music.
No, that right now,
He's more important.
we'll see, you know, I don't know whether this is, my housekeeper of 12 years is suing me. So at one time she did take care of some of these things. I'm about to become very, very self-sufficient. You know, I'm more self-sufficient now than, I don't mind to do these things. I like to do my own grocery shopping. People do recognize you. They are kind of shocked. Some people are upset to see you doing ordinary things. Those people, if they were a celebrity, they would have an entourage. The people who are upset to see you alone, you can tell. You know, I know how you'd operate, you know. Some people like it. It makes them feel at ease, you know. It confirms their hopes that you are, in fact, similar to them. You know, and some people can't stand it. One time I sat down, we had good tickets on the floor at some rock concert. When we moved in, we got there late, and the fellow sitting next to me said, "You can't sit here." I said, "Why not? I've got tickets." And I showed him my ticket stubs. So he said, "But you're Joni Mitchell." I said, "So?" He said, "Well, you shouldn't be sitting there. You should be backstage, or you should be up in that box." He was very annoyed that I had sat in what he considered a common place, you know, whereas someone else would relish it. You know, I mean, you can't please them. Yeah, I like my freedom. I like to move around. I travel. I've driven across country by myself. I used, when I felt that fame, you know, people were nosing me out, well, I moved on. I used traveling names, wigs if necessary. I used wigs in New Orleans. I didn't think I had much of a following in the South. I thought I was anonymous down there, so I kept to the South, but I found in certain pockets that I was quite recognizable, and I just hit a wig store.
Did you ever fall for it? I mean, did you ever get bitten by when it first happened?
Entourage?
Yeah, entourage.
Oh, no.
Elliot never forced that on you, or said you should have all these people around you, or anyone?
Well, Elliot, people were very protective of me, overly so. I mean, you know, I was in the industry for a long time before I had any idea of what drugs people were doing. You know, I mean, I just think, geez, looking awful skinny, why doesn't he have an appetite? Or, you know, I was very, very sheltered by Elliot and CSN and those people when I first entered into it. I was young for my age, not as naive as they expected, but, you know, I don't know why I seem to bring that out in people, that they would shout out. You know, even in my early teens, in my hometown, I could go, I liked to dance, and the best dances were in tough areas. And I was always very protected, made sure I had to walk to my bus stop. People always kind of looked out for me in that way. But I really like wandering around by myself, especially in New York. I like wandering around, and there I'm spotted, but people usually holler at me from across the street, and it gives me a sense of that being my neighborhood.
Do you still have the place in New York?
I have to, I'm letting it go this December.
We're letting ours go too. I find
My lease comes up.
yeah, well, we bought something, and we're not there enough. We bought a big apartment. I thought I was gonna be there about 5, 6 months a year. And I find after about 10 days or 2 weeks, as much as I've been going for 20 times a year, I get wiped out after about 10 days. I can't take any more than that. And you can't have a full-time apartment there if that's all you're gonna do. If you're
Yeah.
go for 10 days.
Well, when I took that place, I lived there for it was a 10-year lease. In the first 4 years, that was my major residence. And now, like, I'm lucky to get there for 2 weeks of the year. And when the rent comes up again, it's going to be not just double, I think it's going to go up by about 6.
You had a loft, didn't you?
I have a really wonderful place in Soho that I got in before Soho was Soho. It was just Little Italy when I was in there. And it's still off the touristy track. It's just away from the Saturday action, the crowds and everything.
Yeah, yeah.
But it's too expensive. It's insane. You got to be a billionaire to live on Manhattan now.
The Yankees still out there. Everybody works. Then I go to the singers, 72-year-old people, Frankie Lane. They're all working. There was a cruise ship routine now. Go ahead.
To take on domestic duty. See, are we off now? And it's.
I'm putting this on now.
We've slid back into the 50s in almost every way. The artist is again in the screw seat in a certain way. You know, he's a bit of a sharecropper. You know, the gold rush is definitely over. I feel the pinch of that, I think, most acutely in, for instance, on the making of the last album. I have by contract my gatefold. You know, even though that's ridiculous in a certain way according to my sales at this particular time in my career. You know, as Elliot pointed out, John, only Prince gets gatefolds, you know, platinum sellers get gatefolds. Well, but I have it by contract because I don't want the standard of my catalog to drop. It's a good format, the lyrics are important, you know, they fall out if you print them on the, you know, on the jacket or the sleeve or something, so it keeps it nice and orderly, and it's like Orville Redenbacher popcorn, you know, or the old Camel package design, you know, when people change.
It's a trademark.
Exactly, you know, so you don't want to lose that. But I found that, for instance, the cover of Hejira, which was expensive to make at the time, but is...
Those are the ice skating equipment.
Right, because of the process. And I did a lot of it myself and didn't paint myself to keep costs down and so on. Well, in the meantime, we went to do this Dog Eat Dog cover, and we could hardly afford on our budget to buy the film for the shoot. We had to rent wolves, we had to buy the film. Norman Seats' fee has, of course, risen. Glenn Christensen, who I started out with in-house at your company, in the meantime is not with Geffen, so he's an independent, and his fee has risen in accordance with the times. By the time I had Norman's fee and Glenn's fee, I was over budget. We haven't even bought film. We hadn't even paid for the wolves. You understand?
Yeah.
You know, so it was just a mess. So what does an artist say? Well, in my case, I say, look, I'll pay for it. Now we pay for our videos. We pay for, you know, the luxury of working with a team that this is my band, Norman Seif and Glenn Christensen. This is my art band in a certain way. I'm used to working with them. We work well. And it's just a shock to find out that I can't, you know, that I have to now disassemble that. All of that because I don't sell enough records. Because digitally speaking, corporately digitally speaking, numerically speaking, I can't work with this. Well, this is a loss of a great, this isn't even a luxury to me. This is like terrible news to me. Now, what am I going to do? Well, so they say, okay, Joan, well, you can write one hit. I say, look, I think I had 4 hits on the last album. You know, but my idea of what a hit is, you can dance to it, it makes you feel a certain way. I don't know what a hit is. I mean, who does? You can go to panels and test cases and nobody really knows.
There's no
what.
analysis.
I mean, in other words, I don't know how to sell out. If I tried to sell out, I don't think I could. By that I mean to make an attempt to make a commercial record. I just make them, and I think if I was a kid, I would like this song. This one is definitely a little artistic, but even with new bands, see, I see new bands coming along like this Boomtown. No, that's a big hit, isn't it? well, that sounds like my idea of a hit. It's the only thing that really kind of interests me that is commercially successful at this time. And I think that in that kind of a context, or a Peter Gabriel kind of a context, or that I am a hit maker. However, I have lost my credibility as a hit maker because of these side excursions into other branches of music. By not being consistent, consistency seems to be all important. Oh, I would do the same thing in a minute. Are you kidding? Oh, I don't. No, but I have no regret. But how then do I regain credibility as a radio artist? You know, so and I don't know how that happens. I don't know how the structure works. You would know that better than I do.
How hard is it to, have you accepted the fact that you don't sell more? I mean, does it make you angry or?
What I'm telling you is, no, it doesn't make me angry. It makes me curious why, you know, for instance, the last record, All Over Town, records that are coming out now that are commercially successful, Rick Ocasek's Till Tuesday, people have been using that record in the studio as an instrument of standard. You know.
I know, I saw it.
Do you know what I mean? Like that. Now, why is a record like that the industry, that the producers, that the artists who are successful recognize as a successful album? Why can't the industry promote it? Why is it? Why? I mean, why am I being forced into a dinosaur situation before?
Well, it's...
Sting is not a Joni Mitchell type, but he's going over my territory.
Yeah.
In other words, when Sting's album came out, I thought, fantastic. Now he's opened a niche because he had the power to make that move, and also because I had, and others like me, you know, we had broken the ice. But why now that door is open, is there...
You know what? You take your best shot. So you do what you do best.
I'm not talking about changing my end. I'm talking about like on
the outside?
Yeah.
There'll be something that'll come along. There'll be something that'll spark something. There'll be some promotion man that'll believe in one of those cuts. There'll be something will flag something. And if it doesn't happen on this record, it'll happen on the next record.
Yeah.
You know, that's the way it'll happen. That's spontaneous, you know, and that's the only way it can happen. You can't go sit and write a song by Rick Ocasek standards or somebody else's standards. You're going to take your best shot. You're listening to the radio, you hear things, okay, you know, things have influenced you for years. It was jazz music, whatever it was, Bob Dylan, whoever, and you go, whatever you do to it, when it synthesizes through your head and comes down on paper and then you put it on the tape, you got to take your best shot doing what you're going to do. And something, if it's not going to come, then it's not going to come. Maybe you ran dry. Maybe there are no more great songs. Who knows?
Oh, no. This will never happen.
I can't believe that'll happen. But I can't believe...
See, our timing, like on the last record, we were 9 months premature. All of the topics on that record, first of all, they were a prophecy of what we're in now in a concrete. You know, all the evangelical material on there was looked upon as alarmist and everything, and then suddenly 10 months later, it is now common sense because it's been all over Time magazine, it's been all over Newsweek. Everybody, you know, so all of this writing was premature journalism.
Make a record and hold it for a year.
Maybe.
Maybe.
You know.
Maybe too.
The same thing happened with Hissing. Hissing was more than...
Well, that was the first departure, wasn't it?
It wasn't that radical a departure from Court and Spark, but you know... Anyways, I don't know what you want to talk to me about today. Probably not this.
Well, no, I want to talk about some of these things. I didn't understand how you, this white girl in Western Canada, got so influenced by people like Miles Davis and jazz. Where did you...
Okay, when I was in high school, I was kind of the school artist. I did backdrops for school plays. I was always involved in illustrating the yearbooks and so on. And I designed a UNICEF Christmas card for the guy who was like our school leader, the senior watch, and he reimbursed me with a Miles Davis album. I had friends who were in college while I was in high school, and I heard Lambert, Hendricks, and Ross, The Hottest New Sound in Jazz, and that record flipped me out. And it was out of print at that time, and I finally bought it off of somebody, and I had to pay a lot of money for it. I think I paid $15 or something, which was unheard of at that time, to buy their copy because you couldn't get it anywhere. And that was my Beatles. In high school, that record was the one I wore thin, you know, that I wore out, that I knew every one of the words to. At that time, if you recall, pop music had gotten very diluted.
Between
It wasn't
Presley and the British.
right. It was before, just prior to the Beatles breaking. Music was like it is now. It was this period of music right now reminds me of it. It was dance oriented, but white pop, sort of slick, boring,
Vanilla.
very vanilla. You know, like the top 20 now is very unexciting, and you almost see the same tendency now. Like there's a lot of, in England especially, kind of folk bands and ethnic bands coming in. The honesty of that music is appealing. That's what happened when the folk boom came across into the pop charts. The music had gotten so slick and so sterile at that time. So I was listening to Lambert, Hendricks, and Ross and Miles, and dancing still to this insipid music. I hadn't begun to make my own music yet. And I like to dance. So when you dance to it, you can escape the fact that it isn't particularly creative, because you're not passive, you're active, so your activity is your enjoyment.
But the first music that you started to play when you had gone to New York, after Detroit you had gone to New York, was really not that much kind of music, wasn't it? More confessional and more in the groove of what was happening with the singer-songwriters then?
Well, the chronology was like this. When I was 19, I went to art school. I had 6 months of teaching myself to play baritone ukulele under my belt, so I was sort of a novice folkie. When I got there was a folk club, and some of the people from the art school frequented it, and I got a weekend job working there and sometimes traveling up to Edmonton. I could pick up some pin money. It was just a hobby. You know, the art was the serious direction. And I was singing folk songs at that time. At that time I was a folk singer. We got them all out of Crawdaddy and Let's Sing Out, and local people had certain repertoires, and they were very territorial about that. You know, I would sing Crow on the Cradle, which was a beautiful song, when Peter Elbling was out of town, and he'd come back and give me a hard time because that was part of his repertoire. I'd say, well, God, you know, everything is part of your repertoire. This guy knew 200 songs, and I was trying to build one. So it was during that time that I wrote my first song. Nobody thought much of it, and I just discarded it. I didn't think anything of it either. I couldn't get any positive feedback. Then I went to Toronto to see the Mariposa Folk Festival, actually to see Buffy St. Marie. I still didn't have an image of myself as a musician. I found I couldn't work, and I didn't have enough money to get in the union, $160. I didn't have it. I worked in women's wear, I worked in a department store, and I could barely make ends meet, and I finally found a scab club in Toronto that allowed me to play. I played there for a couple of months. Then I married Chuck Mitchell, and I moved across the border, and we still were scrambling to work. As a couple, we were making $15 a night, and there were clubs that were very cliquish that we couldn't get into. Well, in Detroit, we had a 5th floor walk-up apartment, and it had some extra rooms. And so when Eric Anderson and David Blue and Tom Rush and people passed through Detroit, we billeted them there. Bruce Langhorne, and they used to stay with us. And Eric taught me a couple of open tunings. Once he taught me open G and a drop D modal tuning. Once I got the open tunings, for some reason, I began to get the harmonic sophistication that I heard that my musical fountain inside was excited by. And once I got those, you know, some interesting chords to play with, my writing began to come. But at that time I was pretty much a good time Charlie. I was a bad student in the school system. I failed the 12th grade. I had done my book reports from classic comics.
Oh, really?
You know, I was anti-intellectual to the nth. Basically, I liked to dance and paint, and that was about it. And as far as serious discussions went, at that time, most of them were pseudo-intellectual, overtly pseudo-intellectual, and boring, you know, like to see teenagers sitting around solving the problems of the world. I thought, all things considered, I'd rather be dancing. So it was Leonard Cohen that I finally, first of all, my husband had an education, he had a degree in literature, and I married into a camp of literary types, and they, not they so much, but Chuck in particular, really didn't believe that you could write unless you read a lot. And considering me an illiterate, he didn't give me a great deal of encouragement regarding my writing, but Tom Rush did. And Tom would come through and say, do you have any new songs? And I'd play him a batch of them, and he'd say, any more? And I'd say, well, there's one more. And I always would hold one out for some reason, thinking it was too sensitive, too feminine for him, and that would always be the one he'd choose. So he chose Urge for Going, he chose Circle Game, and where he traveled and played those songs, clubs opened up to me because the song was my introduction to that club work. So then I began to expand. I was playing as far south as Florida, and I played in Fort Bragg, which was interesting, to gung-ho soldiers while everybody I knew was burning their draft cards and claiming homosexuality and everything, to, you know, anything they could to get out of the draft. I played in Charleston, which was to the Navy, and to these women from Savannah who were the worst audience in the world. They talked all the way through your set, because if the boyfriend gave you a moment of attention, they couldn't stand, you know. So it would always be the buzz of women in Charleston.
Were you booking yourself?
I booked myself.
Did all this all on your own?
Yeah, that was my own.
No band, no nothing?
Nope, I booked myself. And at that time I met Elliot Roberts, who came in. I had a hard time working in New York. I used to beg these clubs to work me, even, you know, as opening act to an opening act to a headliner. And finally, in that capacity, one night Elliot came in to hear the comic. He was second on the bill and I was third. And he, of course, the crowd was talking over me, because opening act is always assumed to be inferior. I had all the material I had from my first two records, and Elliot thought, mind you, he also had, you know, Elliot thought it was good, and Buffy St. Marie had touted me to him also, and she was in the stable that he was associated with. So immediately after that, we came to California. As soon as I signed with Elliot, we moved west. And
we thought you emerged full blown. You were the princess right from the start. You know, it was hard for us to even think of you playing Fort Bragg or Charleston. It was either good selling from Elliot and later David as well, or just listening to the first album, you know, which was rather an amazing record. And we were a singer-songwriter kind of record company at the time, so we had some pretty good judgments. These were all pretty personal songs too, weren't they?
Not initially, no.
Later on.
They were by the fourth album. The first album, Song to a Seagull was the first one. Clouds was the second. Let's see, Ladies of the Canyon was the third. Yeah, and Blue was where.
Blue was the fourth album. That's when it really.
Blue was when it became confessional.
What happened at?
Well, I liked playing in small clubs. I really liked holding the attention of 30 or 40 people. I'd never liked the roar of the big crowd. I was very maladjusted to it. I didn't like the sound of people gasping at the mere mention of my name. It horrified me. It also, for a lot of reasons, because I knew people were fickle. I knew that they were buying an illusion, and I thought, well, maybe they should know who I am, a little more. Let's see. I wanted to believe that the attention that I was getting was for I didn't want there to be such a gulf between who I presented and who I was. I couldn't live that lie somehow or other. This is, it affects everybody differently, but first of all, as Geffen pointed out, he said, the only star I ever met that wanted to be ordinary, I never really wanted to be a star. Exercising my talent as it developed, I didn't even know I had that talent, but as it developed, the exercising of it became important. You can't just turn your back on a talent. But along with it came some things that I couldn't handle emotionally. I didn't like entering a room with all eyes on me. I still don't really like the attention of a birthday party. I prefer Christmas, which is everybody's holiday. It's just my nature. I don't like to be that zeroed in on, like on mass. Over the years, I've adjusted to it, and the last few tours. Now I'm the other way around. You can give me 400,000 hostile people, and I won't even break sweat. But if you give me 200 adoring people, my mouth will dry up because I have no experience like at that end anymore. But coming into it, it was the other way around. I was intimidated by the large roar.
Well, the large roar really came loose with Courtney Spark, with a couple of top 30 singles, Grammy nominations. Were you able to deal with that, or was that just in stride?
No, to me the large roar was, this was even before I started recording. I went to the Newport Folk Festival. Judy Collins called me up. She was supposed to take me. Al Cooper had put us in touch, and we were supposed to meet and go to the Newport Festival. Well, Judy stood me up, and Judy was my hero. So it was kind of heartbreaking. I waited and I waited and waited, and she never came to pick me up to take me to this thing. So a day went by, and I got a phone call from her, and she sounded kind of sheepish, and she said somebody had sung one of my songs in a workshop. It was a terrible rendition, but people went crazy, you know, so she really felt that I should be there. And she gave me instructions how to come and how to get there, and, you know, they billeted me when I got there. Well, anyway, when I played, I got the large roar, and it made me incredibly nervous. And that night, my girlfriend, Jane Lurie, and I, she was road managing for me, we went to a party in one of those old mansions. Standing at the gate, it was like Studio 54, standing at the gate were some people who couldn't get in, and a guard. And he said, he asked us for some kind of credentials, and I kind of waxed passive and backed down. And Jane was always trying to get me to use my existential edge, said, you know, do you know who she is? And I was an unknown, really, except for this performance. And he said, no, I don't know who she is. She said my name, and these kids standing at the gate went, oh, and sucked their breath in like that. And my heart started to beat like crazy, and I ran in the other direction, and I ran and I ran and I ran. I must have ran about 5 blocks, and because it pumped me so full of adrenaline. And I slowed down. I thought, oh God, you know, what a strange reaction. So I came back to Jane. I said, that's a really crazy reaction. But she said, I think it's a healthy thing to do, you know. And in fact, it really was, because you burn off all of that adrenaline. You know, I mean, adrenaline is given to you to stand your ground or to flee, right? So I just took off like a crazed animal, you know, like.
But you didn't love it at all, or was it just curious, this reaction? Had to be some satisfaction in knowing you were recognized like that.
No, it wasn't. It wasn't like that. It has to do. How do you like it if supposing some girl has a horrendous crush on you, and you don't really know her and you can't reciprocate? How do you feel? It's awkward, isn't it?
Sure.
Well, to me, that's what it was, only on a larger scale. Suddenly, you know, I was used to singing my heart out and receiving, except in a few venues, you know, where they were small and we all kind of knew each other and it was kind of fun. I was always up against it, you know, and suddenly to receive this mass adoration, something about it struck me as unreal. It happened so large and so close to fighting an audience for their attention.
Well, later on, when you had this run of very successful records, how much were you aware of how much you were being imitated and how people were talking about she sounds like, or she writes like, or she's, you know, very represented? Were you aware of that at all?
Well, I did read my press, and for the most part, I found that they always lumped me in with the women, whereas in fact, what I was doing was not what most of the women were doing. My peer group was really Phil Oakes and Dylan and Eric and David Blue. Basically, that was my peer group. But they had me lumped in with Judy Collins, who didn't really write at that time, and Baez, mainly on that I was a woman with an acoustic guitar. So then later on there came some women who were somewhat writers, I would call them, but not really, you know, like they could kind of write, you know, like...
Not very many.
Well, it was Janice and then they lumped me in with Janice and Carly.
Carly.
Well, Laura
started early.
Laura's an exception. Now, Laura, I would say you could lump us together and that would be fine because we were odd ducks. We were doing something that no one was doing at that time. For a while, they did lump us together, and I say that's fine. I admit I belong to this group, but I do not belong to the Janician, Carly Simon school. No, not at all.
You also got lumped with Laurel Canyon. maybe it was because of label identification, but all of a sudden you were with the Eagles and Jackson. When they talked about California rock, you became part of that. Was that valid at all?
Yes and no. I didn't really have that sound or that predilection to sound, which was a little on, white rhythm and blues, or, coming out of Buddy Holly tributaries. See, at the time that I went to put a band together, I tried to use the section and the bands that were being used as James went,
Russ Kunkel, Lee Sklar.
as the folk singers went folk rock and that idiom developed. I tried to use the same players, which would have probably, if it had been possible, there might have been more commercial success at that time period. But it was heartbreaking. They didn't understand the voicings of my music, where the voicing had maybe 7 colors in it. They would play a 3 or a 4 color chord against it. Or where the polyrhythmic aspect of my work, they just play 2 and 4 all the way through it, and the subtle time changes and things would get lost. So I was unable to articulate to them what to do, but what they were doing instinctively was breaking my heart. And finally it was Russ Kunkel that turned to me, and I'd just fall in there. I wouldn't be able to explain it, so I just kind of get depressed. And I wouldn't be able to guide them. Russ said to me, "Look, Joni, I think you're going to have to play with jazz musicians." So I went down to the Baked Potato one night to hear a band play, which was the LA Express. And they were really exciting. The LA Express at that time was Larry Carlton on guitar, and Tom Scott and John Guerin and Max Bennett. And I was very impressed with that band. It sounded good to me.
It'd be hard to get them to play with you too.
Well, at first they thought it was kind of folky, and they were bigoted. See, the camps were really divided then. They're not now. There's been a lot of cross-pollination since that time. But then if you were folk, you were folk, and you were jazz, and you were rock, and you were rock. And folk rock was the first kind of hybrid-y thing. But otherwise, never the twain shall meet. So yeah, there was a bit of prejudice, but once they tried to make their lead sheets, once they started writing out the chords that we're playing, they go, "Gee, you realize what she's playing here? The da-da-da-da-da." So then they'd get intrigued because of the drones and because of the open voicing, you were entering into a kind of harmony that was not jazz. It didn't have traditional jazz movement or structure, but it was more sophisticated than pop music was at that time. Not at this time. There's a lot of more complex chords in this new wave of rock and roll that's come along. But in the California grouping and the CSN and all of that, the harmonies were pretty simple. Yeah. I mean, you can see it, like if you look at jazz, like you got Pork Pie Hat.
You mean Lester Young?
Lester Young. So Lester Young was playing sevenths, and he had brought some distinctive change to the harmony of jazz. And then Charlie Parker comes along and he starts playing ninths and 13ths and some stuff, and the harmony changes again. And then after that, it just went, avant-garde, and it just went all over the place, right? So that legwork, musically, that adventure had already occurred in another field, but it hadn't occurred in pop. So, and yet I was doing it because I'd assimilated a certain amount of this harmony and had incorporated it into folk music. And by the tuning, I could set up chords that had this modern sound to me that I'd assimilated from jazz, but I still looked like a folk singer.
What record was that you brought in Tom Scott and Larry and those people?
Court and Spark. That was
yeah.
The 6th record.
And then with the hissing, with this slight change, it wasn't a major change, but then you really you indulged all these old loves of jazz and music, and you really started to make some very jazz-flavored records.
Well, what I think happened, between Court and Spark and Hissing, it wasn't that radical a change. No. The standard of the writing was just as high. It was no deeper. For some reason, I've seen it happen, since then. It was a mystery to me how Court and Spark could be so loved and Hissing could be so hated. And the change could be perceived as so radical. For one thing, I introduced ethnic drums. I'd always loved that Burundi piece of music. And what I played against that was very eccentric. The bass part on it didn't play the root of the chord. Max Bennett kept saying, no, that's wrong, like you're not playing the root of the chord. So I'd done something eccentric to the bottom end of it on two levels. One, I was playing counter melody on the bottom instead of rooting it, and I was using this wild pre-bow diddly lick that I had lifted out. Well, in the new wave, that sound has really been, Adam Ant. And using African music, it's only now that that's becoming in vogue. Well, they hated that. That was one thing that I got strung out for. They really crucified me for that, and especially Rolling Stone. It was almost slanderous in its description of that experiment. Nobody noticed the caliber of the writing. Asia and Gaucho came along later, two classy projects. Hard to get two records back to back with that much musicianship and that quality of lyricism. Asia was loved and Gaucho was slandered, and kind of, it did all right, but it got dumped on. And it's my theory that if they're both of the same period as our Court and Spark, which was also very experimental, that Down to You was one of the longest pop songs you ever heard. And if they'd been released in reverse order, I think Hissing would have been loved and Court and Spark would have been hated. Well, I know Gaucho and Asia, I bet you. The thing, it's almost like human nature. If something is really loved, look at what's happening to Tina this time. They're trying to tear Tina down, right? Because she was successful with her last project. Because they loved it so much, they're coming back looking to love this next one that much. It happened with the Beatles.
If you do the same thing, you're put down for doing chapter 2.
Right.
And if you change, how could you change? And I used to debate Bob Hilbert on that.
And even if it's the same period, even if it was like a painter's same period, interchangeable, the two collections, right? And they loved one, they're going to hate the next one, generally because they think you're going to get too puffed up. They've had enough positive attention. Editorial policy, send in the cartoonists.
What's your guess on what will happen to Bruce Springsteen?
When he releases the next record?
This is 2 records down the line or something. Do you think they'll turn on him?
I don't know.
Yeah, hard to tell. He may be above it at this moment, but you can't bet it would last. They did it to Elton. They did it to the Beatles. How much does that bother you?
What?
The critical reviews.
Well, I think it's unfortunate. It bothers me on this level because it's a chain reaction. That people, a certain amount of the populace are sheep, and if a critic lambastes you, unfortunately, even though he's a shoddy little writer to begin with, underpaid and jealous to boot, has an axe to grind, that his word can influence a certain amount of people who can't think for themselves. And plus, these reviews do tend to get accumulative, they tend to get regurgitated. Lazy reviewers look up other people's reviews and they write the same thing. So you get people writing crap based on crap, right? It does have a power to influence, and the power to influence has cost me those extra records, which means that I have to haggle over paying Glenn Christensen and Norman Seeff. Norman threw in the price of his film on the making of this last. He didn't charge me for the film because we couldn't, it's when the budget gets so tight. And I know that you could pick up more sales if this guy hadn't said, okay, for instance, this is how it works. I was very cooperative. I was more cooperative than I have ever been in my entire career regarding this last album. You want me to do some press? I said, I'll do some press. I did almost everything that was offered to me. I was in Peter's office all day. I was doing 12, 14, 16 interviews, long days, constantly. Okay, send in the next one. Here's a phoner. Okay, running off at the mouth all day long, hustling, right? So after about a week of this, I get Toronto wants to interview you. So they give me about 8 projects in Toronto. I say, oh, now I'm starting to wear down. I'll take this one, this one, this one, and this one. The two that I omitted, the two newspapers that I omitted doing interviews with, gave me the worst interviews worldwide on this the worst reviews worldwide. Now, there's got to be some correlation. They got slighted, right? And the things that they wrote were really stupid. I wanted to call a guy up. Like, he said to me, first of all, in this era, as you know, with records coming out, lyrics are not important. In the context of records that are being released now, like, my writing is really good, you know, like, in the context of things that, I don't even have the running mates that I had a decade ago, generally speaking. So this guy writes, you know, that he never read such sophomoric lyrics. I wanted to call him up and say to him, you know, please turn me on to these excellent lyrics against which you are measuring me. You know, if these are sophomoric lyrics, I would really like you to turn me on to the records that you like, where the lyrics are not sophomoric, you know. Things like that, they're irritating because somebody who doesn't know what they're talking about has the power, based on some little vendetta like that, to influence, you know.
Don't you think you still have a good deal of residual goodwill in the music world, in the press, and the radio that's out there?
Scattered. Rolling Stone hates me. They must have an editorial policy to do me in.
And we tried
for
to
many
patch it
years.
up. You wanted to have a I'll miss this.
What happened? I don't remember this.
You started with Elektra. You know, here I was over at Warner, so now I come over to Elektra.
He is an asshole, you know.
Of course he is. Now, Elliot calls me and says, Joan wants to meet the press and make amends for things that have happened and make peace. She's going to be playing in Nassau. I said, at 9:30 the next morning, I'm the keynote speaker at the R&R convention in Atlanta. He says, you got to do it, even if you have to charter a plane. I said, oh, God. So I came to New York, and I remember I came from Atlanta. I got to Atlanta the day before, and then I flew up. And yet winter comes up, and I do a little number on him, and I set it up, and you come over, and the next thing I hear is you calling him an ass. I'll never forget. The Rolling Stone has been on your case. On the other hand,
that wasn't too successful. Then she did this one, that one. That one wasn't too successful. And then she married her bass player. That's how I go down in history. You know, it's like just that one was a dog, and that one was a dog.
Well, it says here, Joni Mitchell might be regretfully inconsistent of late, but although she may be, the spirit of romance and artistic wanderlust that percolates through her work make her an important standard bearer in the confessional singer-songwriter genre. I think that's kind of backhand.
Really? God.
You would do it.
Also ran.
What, is there a shot? What has happened to all the rest of your compatriots in the singer-songwriter world there?
Like who?
James,
I remember when I was making Court and Spark, which was my most successful project, David was trying to sign Dylan to for the Planet Waves project, and so David and I were sharing a house, you know, and so I'd been working all this under his nose, and maybe he'd heard it through too many stages, and it didn't. But I knew I was making something. I was excited about it. You can tell when you're making something fresh, and being a freshness freak, you're looking for it, and even the Mingus project, I was searching. I tried a lot of different bands, and a lot of them were great players who at that particular time I felt were kind of stagnant, or that particular evening they weren't surpassing themselves. You know, you're waiting for something new to happen all the time. So with Court and Spark, I felt really that this was something new, you know, that it wasn't folk rock, it was a new idiom that was being birthed here, and it was very musical. I was excited. So it came the night to play it back. It was Louis Kemp and Bobby, and Louis Kemp's girlfriend, I forget her name. And I played Court and Spark, and Bobby fell asleep and snored all the way through it. And when the record came to an end, they went, and they put on Planet Waves, you know, and everybody jumped up and down. There was so much enthusiasm, you know. Planet Waves wasn't one of Bobby's best projects. It wasn't as if you were A-Bing. I hadn't expected it to be a competitive situation, but suddenly I thought, God, you know, it's the first time in my career I felt like sibling rivalry here, you know, because I know that, you know, this is an ordinary record for Bobby. This is a transitional piece. It's not that everybody was cheering, jumping up and down, And this girlfriend of Louis came over, took me aside, and she said, "Oh God," she said, "those boys," she said, "I don't think they have any ears." So she kind of gave me some comfort on that. But I couldn't get any action. The only thing that David said about that album was that he wanted the portrait of him taken off. He didn't rest easy with that. The one song. And I said to him, "Well, look, it's only things that you've been saying, all I've done is quoted you. I was a free man in Paris, right?" He hated that portrait. It took him about 3 years to like it, and then I noticed he was bright. "That's about me," I'd hear him say. So you got used to it.
As you look back on the making of that album, was there anything special happening that made it so fresh and new? Was it just the quality of songs, or because that's a classic album. If you listen albums you take away with you, that's one of the great albums people want to always list. Did anything special happen during the making of the record, instrumentally, musically? Or?
Well, I'll tell you what I remember is that the bottom end of music was changing. At that time in the music, there are fads that occur, like in various sound-wise in sectors of the instruments. And generally speaking, you can't get them to, that's what's hip and that's it. And if you try and get somebody to step outside that, it's like pulling teeth. Well, it was hip at that time to have dead strings on your bass and have your kick drum all stuffed full of pillow. So the bottom end was telescoped back into the track, and it was kind of dead. It didn't have any round fullness to it. Didn't have enough trash to it, Since this was the first time I was working with a band, in the back of my mind was the bottom end of the music in the late 50s, which was another sound altogether. The bass was very boomy, and you could hear it like blocks away if it was playing on a jukebox someplace. Now it'd telescope. And I also was trying in the mix level to get it to come up forward, which didn't happen for a few years later. And I met with resistance from just about everybody, the players, and from Henry. Like on Down to You, there's a place in the music where it goes, it's in the instrumental section where it goes doom, 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 and then it releases, but there's about 4 or 5 pushes, and I was on the fader pushing. This was my first year on the fader. There was nothing to mix like for the first 4 records, right? So I'm saying each one of these has got to be louder than the next, and the last one's got to make the needle go berserk. Well, you didn't do that, so Henry kept pulling my hand down on the fader. At that time, Stevie Wonder was working with Moog Bottom, and the bottom was changed. So finally I took Henry over and took our tapes over to Cecil and Margoloff's session, and Stevie was there. And I put it on the turntable, because they had their bass focused just right, like right over the mixing and everything, and I thought, I'll play it here, we'll be hearing how they're working with the bottom end first, and then we'll play it here, and maybe you get the picture that there's a lot of room to bring it forward, So that helped. And we came back and pulled it a little bit forward, but I'd still like to remix it to this day, It would have held up it's classic, but it would have had more classicism if it wasn't for this imposition of style. And for instance, I'll tell you what the imposition of style I was fighting on the last record was in the treble end, not in the bottom. The bottom now, as we know, is up front, or to an irritating degree. Sometimes it's too far up front in the mixes. Big snare drum right in your face, right? And you'll have a guitar player screaming, now he's telescoped back in. Well, it was the other way around in the 60s. So the thing was the high-end sounds, the synthesizer frequencies in the high-end department, hi-fi or lo-fi, all the sounds that I kept picking that I wanted to use were round and warm and almost 40s-ish, when the horn sounds that I was selecting to use on this piece of music. Whereas, generally speaking, what seems to be exciting and with it, and they go hand in hand, which I'm not so interested in what is with it, but what is fresh. right? I'm already sick of what is with it, but what is with it is a lot of high-end buzz. And if you get a radio station, for instance, that plays oldies, plays 60s, 70s, 50s
Yes, yeah.
back, you'll find that as soon as the 80s music comes back on, it's extremely irritating overall. It's designed to, it's an exciter, but it's also a stressor. You know, it's sort of, it's got all this high-end fingernails on the blackboard, screechy stuff on it, which I don't really care for. I still use it. You can use it a little bit, but I like to do a backwash of rounder
Soften it out a
sounds.
little bit, yeah.
Put your, well, if you do too much of that, people will say it has no energy or it's too mellow, and you'll get stuck over on MOR, right? It's not that you want MOR, but you don't. This other thing is you know, it'll break one of these days. You'll see it, and it's going to sound like a wah-wah pedal. So in order to give your music continuity and classicism and lasting quality, you want to sidestep some of these things. And it's hard. It's like pulling teeth because everybody's kind of trendy on their acts.
Well, none of these were real considerations during the making of the Mingus album, were they?
Yes.
They were?
And the Mingus album, I had a different set of problems. First of all, Charlie was he was prejudiced against electric music to begin with. So to please him, which I wanted to do more than anything, I'm writing a man's epitaph. You know, I had to use musicians that he suggested, and they were all acoustic. Well, the band that I really wanted to use was an electric band. It was, well, Herbie could play electric or he could play acoustic, so there was some versatility there. But electric bass, definitely Jocko. And Charles was down on electric bass. And Wayne Shorter. Well, that was the band I wanted to use, but Charlie wasn't keen on that. So I ran all the personnel that he suggested. And I'd go to these dates and we'd cut the song and I'd come back, I'd be like down and he'd say, you know, he plays do-notey, don't he? You know, or he knew all of the shortcomings of all these players. I'd say, yeah, you know, it's just, you know, it's not happening. Charlie had written fairly traditional melodies. I had these traditional melodies to work with. Basically, to me, they sounded like they were a dead idiom. And coloring them acoustically was going to make them more dead. So I didn't want to come in to the jazz arena as an outsider playing a dead traditional sound. I wanted to bring something to it. It had to be fresh. So I tried all kinds of personnel. That's why that record was expensive. Because we scrapped versions, and there were some that grooved better than the ones that I ended up with. There's some I even sang better on. But overall, I was going for okay, I'll give you an example of one thing. When Charles was teaching me the melodies, he played me a lot of things of his that had been done by different people, and he was constantly saying, "He playing the wrong note. That's the wrong note." So I got brainwashed with the wrong note, the wrong note, the wrong note. Well, when it came to writing this one song called Sweet Sucker Dance, at the end of a phrase, when I got my words on it, it was supposed to go ba 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 da do do to a blue note, like ends up on, you know. And the way the words were, it sounded better if I went ba da ba 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 ba, right, to open it up. So Charlie, I go and I sing it that way, and Charlie says to me, "You singing the wrong note." I said, "I know, but Charlie, if you listen to the word, it seems better if it goes up than if it goes to a blue note to me here." And he said, "But that's a square note." I said, "Well, you know, Charlie, your note's been hip so long
It's not square.
that it's square now. Like, you know, let me sing that, and this one's been square so long that it's hip now." And he looked at me, he gave me a real wry look, and he said to me, "Okay, motherfucker, you sing your note and my note and put in a grace note for God."
I heard there was a couple of points in that album that you really lost heart, that it looked like it was so difficult. You wanted to walk, and then you couldn't walk away from it.
I could, well, the one place, Goodbye Pork Pie Hat, Charlie assailed me with all kinds of Lester Young history. What Lester's father was like, how he grew up, and all the time, every time he told me a story.
So the Lester Young, he was telling you the story of the family, and go ahead.
Well, he played me a lyric that had been set, you know, Goodbye Pork Pie Hat at that point was a song that had been around for a number of years already, without lyrics. And Hendrix had set words to them. And Hendrix was one of my teenage heroes. So he played me this version that Hendrix had written. And he watched me while I listened to it. Charlie was looking at me. And it was awful. It was maudlin. It was like, you know, oh, the poor black guy on the Chitlin circuit, right? It was like not good. So, you know, when it was all done, Charlie looks at me and he said, it's awful, isn't it? It's awful. You know, I was surprised because if there's anybody that can write good lyrics, he's the guy to jazz, right? So then he gives me about 5 or 6 versions of Pork Pie Hat. Tells me to take my choice. Each one has a different solo. That's Miss Puss. She's saying hello. And I picked one that I liked the solo the best in, and it had a passage of triple tonguing in it. So I said, well, I like this one the best, but I suppose you want me to set lyrics, you know, to this section too. He says, yeah. Well, it's humanly impossible, you know. So not only was it hard to memorize that melody. It was like an aria, you know. It was very complex, that solo.
Sure, yeah.
And then to parquet it, and the way I am I'm a stickler for the word being married to the melody without messing with English inflection. So if a word has a certain emphasis on a certain syllable, the melody has to too. So between the difficulty of the melody to begin with and this, you know, standard to my craft, it was a nightmare of this thing. And then in the telling of the story, what am I going to tell? Well, I'm going to tell about, I decided that all 3 of us were going to be in the song, that Lester was going to be in it, that Charlie was going to be in it, and that I was going to be in it also as a narrator, you know. So I had it all written, but I couldn't get the last verse, and Charles was dying. I mean, he was deteriorating rapidly, and I wanted so much to have this completed before he died. You know, I wanted him to see it all finished so he could lie down easy, you know. So it was a race against time, and that made it doubly frustrating. And I couldn't get an ending, and I couldn't get an ending. And one night, Don Elias and I took a bus uptown, and for some reason, he decided we should get off a block early. We got off, we came up out of the subway, we came up like in a cloud of steam on somewhere in the late 40s or the early 50s at about 8th Street, I think, or something. So we look ahead, and 2 blocks up the street, you see this group of pimps standing there. You know they're pimps. They all got the same hat on, broad-brimmed, light-colored with a dark ribbon on it. So I'm curious. I say, what are they looking at, you know? And it's right on our route. So we go walking up to this place. It's under a red and black striped awning that this is taking place. Red and black striped awning, circle of pimps, 2 little kids. They were the first paupers I'd ever seen. One was about 9, one was about 12, and it was about midnight. They were up in the street and they're dancing, like doing all of this robot action. And these pimps are laughing, and one of these guys slaps his thigh, bends over and says, well, it looks like the end of tap dancing, he says. And suddenly I got this picture. These kids were like the new growth, you know. I thought, you know, even with Lester gone and Charlie going, there's always something innovative coming along, because I'd never seen this dance. And just then I looked up, and the next bar down in red script said Charlie's. So I took it to be an omen, you know, and I turned to Don, I said, this is my last verse. So I got very alert, and we stood there for a while laughing, watching these kids dance. And as we turned to leave, I took one glimpse back, and you know what it said on the red and black striped awning? Pork Pie Hat Bar. Oh! The name of the bar.
Named after Lester?
Yeah. So one night we went into this bar. I kept pestering to take me in there. Well, it was in a tough neighborhood, and it was like where the pimps, when they have their women around on the corner, you know, they go in. So it wasn't exactly a place for a blonde woman to be going. And I kept pestering Dawn, you know, to take me in there for a long time. Finally, one winter's day, we pulled into the parking lot next door, and he said, okay, tonight we're going in. We went into this place. It had a red and a blue light bulb, or a red and green or something, you know, some kind of like bohemian lighting. Black and white posters of Lester all around the place. There was a Lester Young record playing on the jukebox as we came in. In the back were all these pimps with their hats on, completely immobile, playing backgammon and chess, just so cool that they didn't ruffle anything. They looked like they were cut out of cardboard. And the whole place was full of this kind of beigey smoke. And up the central aisle, the only thing that was moving, aside from, was this guy, the same guy, this was nearly a year later, that said, looks like the end of tap dancing. And he was just tapping up a storm. Up and down the aisle, he kept dancing up and down the aisle. And behind the bar was a guy who was kind of pear-shaped. He looked like like a, what do you call it, an endomorph? He had small shoulders and was given to putting on fatty tissue. He must have had some female hormones in him, like what's that guy that's the performer in Vegas?
Yeah. I know what you mean.
You know what I
Yeah,
mean?
know what you mean.
He just had like sort of Anyway, he was wiping a glass behind the bar, and there was one woman in there. It was all men in there, all pimps in there. It was a pimp's bar, right? But it was so colorful, you know.
And it was, my God, what a sign from someone.
Yeah.
Before playing that thing. You've never, or have you exhausted at the moment your investigations into jazz kind of projects, or?
Well, see, jazz excites. I like certain periods of jazz, and I like them when they were living, but it doesn't take them long to cool off. Do you know what I mean? And right now, I don't think there's much being done in jazz. Weather Report were exceptional. As a matter of fact, a lot of the new wave. Let me start this sentence again. They were doing the most fascinating sounds in the latter 70s. The sound of Weather Report's music, to me, was more interesting than anything. Then came the British invasion and all this Fairlight and so on, and pop music began to also play around with those sounds. Weather Report made about 3 or 4 or 5, great albums, and then they kind of cooled or something. Jocko went into his madness, and they got a new bass player, but it seemed to peak with Jocko. I don't think after Jocko left that they didn't really interest me as a band. As individuals, Shorter is always great. He's a forever great musician like Miles,
But there's nothing happening in jazz that you would like to play with now?
No.
It only seems to me there's been a few great players.
Miles I would like to play. I would love to play with Miles.
How about Wynton Marsalis or somebody like Stanley Jordan? I don't know if you can do anything with them. They're off by themselves, kind of. They're making individual music. They could make solo albums with no band at all, but and it's a lot of technique. But I don't hear anything, and I'm a crazed jazz buff.
Yeah, I don't think it's. I think the exciting field right now is pop music, because pop music is suddenly getting more sophisticated. Like I think Steely Dan, I think Peter Gabriel. There aren't that many there either.
Do you listen a lot?
Well, my husband listens to everything. He buys literally every new release that comes out.
And do you listen?
And I listen. He kind of filters it down too, and we listen to some things together. There's very little to discover right now. It's not an exciting time anywhere in music or in the arts. Look what's happening in painting, neoclassicism. There isn't. It's not an exciting time. I mean, it's searching. It's searching for something new, with the possibility that. You hear things like. What was the new one I heard the other day? Heavy Nova. Heavy Nova. Somebody's gonna right. Heavy Nova.
Heavy metal.
Right. So there are these like strange hybrids that are being attempted.
Such a delicate music. I can't imagine being heavy.
Heavy Nova.
I read the interview you did with Rolling Stone a few years ago with Cameron Crowe, and you said there were times when you wanted to just pack it all in and not do it anymore, and you thought about living up in a solar heated something or other. You knew you couldn't do that, but there are periods, aren't there, in any creative person where you just say, I can't do this anymore?
Yeah. I've been threatening to quit since the day I started it. I've always said, this is the last one. I mean, even on the first record, I'm midway down the midway and I'm already slowing down. That's a metaphor for, see, I came in late. I came into, people think I'm a peer of Judy Collins and Joan Baez, but I'm not. I'm a wave after that. I'm with Jackson and they'd been around for many years before I even touched an instrument. So I'm not really a contemporary of Dylan either. And at the time that I came into the business, like I'm contemporary, well, even CSN, they had already been around for a while. Graham with the Hollies and the Birds. I don't know who.
Your first record.
Jimi Hendrix and I were signed at the same year.
Signed about the same time.
Yeah, so he would be. Yeah. I'm like a.
Do you ever hit periods where nothing comes? I mean, when you're writing, are there dry periods there, or are you prolific enough to keep writing?
Well, musically, I would never run dry. If any time I sit down to an instrument, I could write a song, and I try not to steal from myself. But the modalities create similarities, musically, I don't think I'd ever dry up. I trust my musical invention. Lyrics are hard. The year that I wrote my love album was the year that, if you looked at, it couldn't have been more off-timed. It was such a cynical year. All the videos had women in high heel shoes, like driving spikes into men's hands, and it was like not a romantic period. And it just happened that I met my husband and got married, so they lambasted that project. You know how many times she said love on this album? It was completely that's the Wild Things one, right? And the looseness of it, the playerishness of it, fell against a time period when the synthesizer was at its most supreme, right? So musically it was out of whack with the times, and topically it was out of whack. Now, if it had been released at the time that Dog Eat Dog, because when Dog Eat Dog came out, it was an angry album, and they said, where are the love songs?
Make a record and hold it for a year.
Yeah, my timing is just rotten, see?
You've also been ambivalent, it seems, about playing in person. There's an awful lot of false starts on tours or things like that. Is it because you're ambivalent, or was there an explanation for all of those?
No. Well, the one that you came out to,
yeah.
I was living with the drummer. We split up just before we hit New York, where you came out, and not wanting to be a tyrant, I told him that since we had split, there was an old girlfriend he wanted to bring out. I said, bring her, you can bring her out, but don't let me see her. Well, there was a fiasco, and also I was coming down with like a terrible flu, and there's the old show must go on, but the combination of this betrayal. Anyway, she did show up. She ended up, as a matter of fact, he went to his usual seat on the plane after one show, and she went into my usual seat, and I had to sit back with the crew. So needless to say, I was in a nasty temper. I was ill. I thought, what, all the money in the world cannot make me finish this tour. And Elliot begged me, please just go to here and here and here so we don't get into big losses. And I took it as far as I could civilly do, and I quit. Now, I've always been frail health. I've had a lot of illness in my life, and the road is a real wear down. So most of it was due to illness, I think, when I canceled out.
Do you look forward now to going out and doing something?
Well, I'll tell you, I had the last tour I took out was wonderful.
Was that last year, was it?
83.
Yeah, no, it's 3 years.
We were out 9 months. The tour chemistry was excellent. The fraternization between tour and crew was the way I like it. It was, I'm sort of a Democrat, or I don't know what you'd call it. I don't like it to get to...
Star and...
right, it's more fun if you can keep it like a big, it's... Anyway, it worked like that for 9 months. I think we had wonderful camaraderie, and I never enjoyed a tour that much since before I hit the record business. It was almost like some kind of maturity on my part, I guess. Late to arrive, but there it was, wasn't it? But also I had a band that could play both rock and jazz.
Who was the band?
Vinnie Colaiuta on drums, my husband Larry on bass, Michael Landau on lead guitar. You know, he comes out of heavy metal,
Yes,
Jimi
of
Hendrix,
course, yeah.
and yet he can play delicate, sophisticated jazz things.
Did you cast this band yourself, or somebody put it together for you?
Well, it evolved out of the record.
Ah, I see, they played the record.
Yeah.
If this explanation is such a backhanded slap, and it is, it makes her an important standard bearer, so how would you like it at this stage of your career to have someone say, this is what Joni Mitchell is, this is what Joni Mitchell has been? Is there some kind of description?
I'm a musician and a poet, you know. I'm a musician and a poet.
And if there was a year or a period of time that you could put in a bottle and put up on a shelf, and 30 years from now, I mean up to now, you know, that you'd say, boy, this was the best, that everything was grooving. Is there a time period you can isolate?
No.
No.
I mean, Don Juan's Reckless Daughter, which is an experimental record, not one of my favorite records at all. It wasn't one that was completed, it was searching, was one of the most visually interesting. I wish I had a film of how that record was made in the studio, the drama, the performance. Get at that line.
The Don Juan's.
In other words, every time, for every negativity, there was always a compensation. The breakup of that tour, the tour that died, the one
Yes.
it died 2 cities after you arrived, after I called Jan an asshole,
Yes.
which doomed my
But the great
my
scenes of
reviews.
rock and roll.
We terminated in what's the name of that? The Edgewater Hotel in Madison, Wisconsin. We got that far, the tour moved out, Joel Bernstein and I stayed behind because the lake at the edge of the Edgewater was frozen over. Now it was about to thaw. It had thawed the day before and then frozen again. So all around the lake, all the trees had glass-like ice on them, thick ice. And if you walked along the banks of it, you could hear this crash and tinkling like breaking glass as these boughs broke under the weight of it. And to get onto the ice, you had to take a big leap. I went through a couple of times before I got on because it was real soft and spongy. And that day it was freezing cold. It was so cold that I got welts all over my face, you know, like from snow coming up off the ice and stinging. It was freezing cold. But anyway, here was the end of the tour, premature abortion of a tour, disaster. Joel and I stay behind. We go into town, I get some skates. I got black skates, which everybody thought was weird because they're men's skates, but I wanted it to all look, I was in mourning. I didn't want any white skates. I wanted black skates, you know. I put these black skates on, I put on this black skirt, and I had a fur cape that Joel thought was kind of ostentatious. It had like ermine tails or something on it, you know. I said, no, this is the costume. And we were going for, do you remember an old song of mine called I Wish I Had a River I Could Skate Away On?
Yes.
We had talked for years about a Hans Brinker kind of shot if we ever found up something frozen to skate on. So on this melancholy occasion, you know, like the end of my long relationship with this man, the premature breaking up of the tour, we were going after this I wish I could had a river I could skate away on, Hans Brinker skating out on the ice image. Well, when we got out there, this cape that I had on turned out to be a sail. You could open it up and the wind would blow you all around, and the shapes that happened from it, I looked like a crow, I looked like a bird. The shapes were surrealistic. We hadn't counted on what happened. It was a really magical photo session, and I still got some. I found some of these prints the other day. Actual, this is all covered with glassy ice.
Wow, of course, I remember that.
And these are Norman's shots that we.
Yeah.
But like this shape. Look at that
Woo!
shape.
Still, do you paint much?
I did. The last 3 years I painted by hand. Large. I haven't done it much this year. I did 30 paintings while we were in England, but small, you know.
Did you see Georgia O'Keeffe before she died, or how long
didn't.
before you didn't see her?
We saw her in '83.
Yeah.
Larry and I went, after the tour ended, I wanted
Was
him
she
to
died
meet her.
85?
She died,
Or
she
year?
died this spring,
This
or
year.
or before spring.
Yeah. Had you been in touch with her at all, or talked with her?
Not since '83.
Yeah.
But we were planning, well, we're going in a couple of weeks, we were planning to go and see her
Yeah.
this fall. But,
And what's ahead? You're just gonna make some songs and make some records? And
I've got a really good record in the works. It's almost completed. But the last one was really good too, you know.
Yes.
I mean, I don't mean to sound immodest, but
No.
what I mean by really good is that my standards are high, and it's hard to get them up to my standards, and these are up to my standards. But I don't know what will happen with it, you know.
I don't. Simply Red is a band now. It's one.
Oh no, I know some. I know
I
them.
mean, you're not because they're making records, or because there's 3 or 4 bands. It's not. You're not going to do that. I mean, that's.
Well, see,
not,
Simply Red has that one. I really like that record.
Well, they're terrific.
No, but if you analyze it, it's really, I could never make a record like that because it's bad lounge jazz. I'm not that dumb about jazz. I couldn't go back and make something, but people at least, you know, it's bringing that music. It's like beginner's jazz in a certain way to people. You know, that's the whole trouble. It's the funniest business, like making a record, because if you're a true artist in a certain way, by that meaning that you didn't do it just to be a pop star, or you didn't do it because you wanted to have, you know, that you were motivated by your talent and not by, you know, that there are hundreds of bands that just want to be somebody, right? Not just going, that don't have any talent. Hype bands,
Yeah.
right? Okay, well, as opposed to an artist who has a musical gift to tap, right? Like a Van Morrison or somebody who really has talent. What's the point I'm trying to
We're
make?
talking about Simply Red and about making records to sound like someone, or to, in a group. But you got to make your records. And,
See, I could be, here's the thing, I could be a Simply Red. For instance, I have a huge, Simply Red, you know how that record came about? That record was out for a long, long time, and one of the video stations liked it and didn't let go of it. In other words, it didn't happen normally. It happened because certain people here and certain people there. It was a real long shot, that thing, and only because some people heard it, and it didn't happen through any brilliance in the business or any brilliance on the record. It just happened kind of accidentally that somebody kept playing, instead of just saying, oh, it didn't happen, yank the video and we won't play it anymore. It kept playing on the easy listening outlet. And some things are slow developers. My record, like Simply Red's music, is slow developer. People now are starting to, it always takes them about a year. They hate it when it first comes out. Peter Gabriel hated my record when it first comes out. He's starting to get into it. People who destroyed it critically when at its first release said, oops, and put it on their 10 favorite list months later. But you can't, those guys get a review of something that has this many layers to it. It's designed to have a certain amount of immediate appeal and to be played and reviewed and discovered. Like anything good, it has to have depth to it. You know, so you have to have a certain amount of grabbability initially, and then something that wears well, that you'll love for years to come. That's what anything fine is. It's recognized in painting. It's not recognized. I'm just working in a toss-away industry. You know, I'm a fine artist working in a commercial arena, you know, so that's my cross to bear. You know, but there are some success stories. Steely Dan, I think, is a great example. You know, that they do fine art in a commercial arena. And, you know, the only reason I'm quite content, you know, I just don't like to see my lack of sales affect my ability to put out quality product. If it gets to that point, what's the point of me staying in? You can bolster it up by saying, I'll pay for that, I'll pay for that, I'll pay for that. And at a certain point, it's ridiculous, it's stupid, you know.
That's what, who was Glenn and Don. Glenn wanted to go out on tour with his first record. Well, nobody, well, he had the money, and I wasn't running any raffle for them, but you can't, there's a point beyond which you don't force it, and it seems to me, as long as you're making records, somebody will provide the money for you to make the kind of records you want.
Well, I mean, this is off the record, okay, because I don't like to do interest. So, we got a group now.
Yeah.
Two heads are better than one. That Annie Ross was right.
How many records have you got to go on this deal?
I've got 3, unfortunately, left.
3 left,
including this one that I'm working on. So 3 more.
Well, and one, including the one that's coming out.
Yeah, 2 after this one.
Well, I thank you for the time today, and we have.
This is actually pretty funny.
Okay, it's running like that as well. Okay.
And I think it was in Studio A. There was a lot of fraternity, and people, would step in. They'd stick their nose in from across the hall to see what you were doing, and it always had that kind of open atmosphere. And sometimes you'd interplay. So one day, Harry Nilsson and Lennon came in and sat down. I forget what song we were working on. But after it had played back once, Lennon jumped up and he said, "Oh, God," he said, "it's all a product of over-education. What you need here is more fiddles. Put fiddles on it. You want a hit, don't you? Why did you ever let Judy Collins have that hit? You should have had that hit." And he walked out, right? So a couple of days later, I went across the hall to watch them recording. Well, Phil, in his true... he likes multiples of everything. So he had multiples of everything. He had a couple of drummers, and he had a couple of piano players, and a couple of bass players, and he had multiples of everything in a very dark room that was honeycombed with baffling, just packed solid with all these guys. Sometimes I think he even had triplicates in there, maybe 3 bass players, 4 guitars. It was just packed with musicians, and it was very dark. There were dimmer switches. So the dimmer switch was way down in the studio, and it was way down in the control booth. And I came in and just kind of took up my position by the door, trying not to, to be real low profile. So this is the way it starts. Lennon wasn't there that day. He says, Spector's wearing little pink-colored glasses, rose-colored sunglasses, and he's got an armed bodyguard there with him. He's got a long, kind of stringy wig, it's a wig, and a hat thrown on over it. He gets on the talkback button and he says, "Okay, guys, now I want the piano player to come in first, and I want the drums to come in, and then the bass player. Okay, you got it? Okay, hit it." So the band strikes up, and it's this huge chord, right? They get about 5 bars into it. He hits the talkback button right into the track. "No, no, no, I told you, the drummer starts first, and then the bass player, and then the piano comes in. Okay, you got it? Let's go." Okay, so they start up again in this new order. They get about 8 bars into it, and he goes, "No, I told you, the bass player starts first, and then the drums come in, and then the piano player, okay?" So they do this again. At this point, I'm stifling a laugh, right? Because it's absurd. It's like the March Hare, like Alice in Wonderland. I've wandered into something weird. So this goes on and on and on. All this coitus interruptus. He keeps starting them and stopping them and blaming them and giving them new instructions. They take 10. Everybody steps out into the hall. I step out into the hall. All the players conspire. They're shaking their heads. They can't believe it. Puss. So they all conspire to take up a different act. When they go back in, the drummers go to basses or pianos or whatever. Everybody plays something else a little bit. They all take over, and he starts them up again. So they're all playing not on their axes, right? "Okay, now I want the keyboard started. Okay, you got this now? You got and then the drums come in, and then the bass player come in." So they started making this record, and everybody was playing on a secondary axe, and he never even noticed. It was so dark in the room. It was so dark in his room. Anyway, at a certain point, I laughed out loud, and he kicked me out. He wouldn't let me back in, so I sent him some roses. I sent him some roses and asked that I please be able to come back in. Because I didn't want to miss it.